A dangerous new Ukrainian drone has been observed in action, while Ukraine most likely attempted an attack on the commander-in-chief of the Russian Air Force. The large-scale Ukrainian attacks on Russian logistics and power supply continue, while another FP-5 Flamingo attack, that is, with the Ukrainian cruise missile, has been documented. In addition, we have the video of a Russian flag being raised at a rather unusual captured location, while Russia is trying to put an end to Ukraine's foreign trade. All this and other news will be covered here in this situation report on the Ukraine war. Holy smokes! Now save the most at Holy with my code. The Ukrainians hit 5 refineries in Russia last week. In addition, they report 2 Sukhoi 35s and 2 L-39s as damaged. The Sukhoi 35S are the powerful Russian multi-role fighters, and the L-39s are trainer aircraft, which could certainly be used to combat drones and, of course, for pilot training. In addition, we have pictures and footage of the attacks. But as for the aircraft that were hit, I haven't seen anything. The Engels Air Base was also attacked again by the Ukrainians. It's unclear what damage was caused. However, smoke was seen rising from the base in aerial footage. Russian strategic bombers are stationed at this airbase, from where they fire Ch-101 cruise missiles at Ukraine. The attacks by the Ukrainians are also continuing to target substations and power plants. Here, we see a long list of the respective attacks. At substations, most of this is also documented with videos, or here, as we can see, directly with images of the fire itself. In addition, the Ukrainians have attacked Wildberries again. Wildberries, this time in Samara. And as we can see, there was apparently another destroyed warehouse. Wildberries was also attacked in Vladimir Oblast, and by now, 16 of the largest logistics centers of Wildberries are said to have been destroyed. The Ukrainians launched or deployed 635 drones just during the night of August 2nd. The Russians confirm this, as Reber reports here. So we can see that the volume of Ukrainian attacks is now almost certainly higher than the number of Russian attacks on Ukraine, even though the Russians intercept most of them, because otherwise, as we can see, we don't see hundreds of hits every night. Reber himself assesses it as follows. The enemy is once again relying on quantity and is carrying out massive missile attacks. Actually, that's a mistranslation, so airstrikes or whatever you want to call them. At the same time, the intensity of the attacks has not decreased for the second month in a row. With thousands of missile launches per month, it's only a matter of time before individual targets are damaged. And even a high interception rate does not guarantee complete security of the infrastructure. Basically, are you addressing the fact that the Ukrainians are deliberately overwhelming Russian air defenses? They send so much that the Russians can't intercept it all. So something eventually gets through, because each individual drone used for the attack is by itself not exactly technically impressive. They are large, they are slow, they carry a relatively small explosive charge, and are therefore relatively easy to intercept. And even if they hit, the damage is somewhat limited, as long as the target is not particularly vulnerable. But if you send several hundred of them every night, and some keep getting through, the damage accumulates and keeps getting bigger. When a drone is shot down by Russian air defense, we have footage of it here. You can see the drone here as it comes down and crashes onto the beach. It was a bathing beach in Krasnodar Krai, and the Russians are reporting 6 deaths at the beach because the drone was shot down by the Russians overhead. We can clearly see here that it was a crash. In addition, the Ukrainians attacked again off Crimea. And here we have this interesting footage that shows us the sea drones off the coast. And here we have the launch of a surface-to-air missile, which was filmed by a sea drone. And up here is the helicopter it's aiming at. However, it seems that it didn't get a good enough lock on the target and missed. But we can see that this would happen again. The Ukrainians are now also using surface-to-air missiles from unmanned sea drones. They have already achieved shootdowns with this, which makes combating these drones even more difficult, because it creates an active threat to the Russian assets being used for defense. In addition, there was another use of an FP-5, And here we can see the FP5 flying by. We can see that it's relatively slow and flying at a really low altitude as it passes by here. The whole thing was, filmed. And of course we shouldn't forget that the top speed of the FP5 that's mentioned isn't necessarily the speed it's using the entire time. Especially when flying so low, it can make sense to reduce speed a bit for navigation, because when it's flying this low, it's naturally harder to shoot down since it's harder to see. By the way, we can see that perfectly here. Imagine if, from the camera's perspective, we had an anti-aircraft gun or something similar. Then the drone appears here on the right, next to, from the right side of the trees. Only now could you shoot at it. And now you couldn't shoot at it anymore. Here, there would already be objects in between again, and it would disappear again. And that's exactly the advantage of really low-level flight. If the drone itself, if the cruise missile itself were flying at 300 meters altitude, it would be significantly easier to intercept, and accordingly, it also makes sense that it's slower in that case. The military informant who reported on this here also addresses the problem with the FP5. Serious issues may occur if the enemy increases cruise missile production or gets long-range cruise missiles from Western nations.
Oder Langstreckenmarschflug.
The Russian Air Force, frankly, has very few AWACS aircraft, which simply would not be enough for the regular surveillance of a large area to repel regular attacks by large groups of cruise missiles, because the Russians report that all 6 FP5S that were deployed were shot down. I also don't see any confirmation that a hit was achieved, so that seems to be true. But once again, we can see the flight path very clearly here, how they're not flying in a straight line, but rather flying around here. And then up here, it was shot down. That means the flight path is obviously wavy, like an S shape or something similar, for example, to evade air defense systems. And that shows how important the intelligence support from the US most likely is. Because knowing exactly where enemy radar and air defense systems are is, of course, what can make the difference as to whether such a cruise missile gets through. Russia has only very few operational A-50s. That's what military informant here call an AWACS aircraft. It's also comparable to the Western AWACS. These are relatively rare. 6 to 8 units are probably operational, most likely not more than that. And the fact that the shootdown was possible, despite this extremely low-altitude flight, is precisely due to the use of these airborne early warning and control aircraft, which can look down from higher altitudes and therefore have less radar shadow, allowing them to detect it. But for that, they have to be operational and in the air. And the Russians certainly won't succeed in doing that every time. In July alone, Russia used more ballistic missiles and cruise missiles than ever before, a total of 376. Of course, Russia is taking advantage of the fact that Ukraine hardly has any PAC-3S left. These are the missiles for the Patriot system, which are suitable for shooting down ballistic missiles. Russia has probably used more cruise missiles and ballistic missiles in the last month than it produces, in order to take maximum advantage of Ukraine's current weakness in air defense. And in previous situation reports, we've repeatedly talked about the fact that only a large portion of the ballistic missiles from the Russian side have gotten through. Let's move on to the developments along the front. And there we have the geolocations from Kozacha Lopan. That's from the Vovchansk area in Kharkiv region up here. Here, infiltrations are happening again towards the south, which have been documented and attacked. The footage shows us that. And we have a few more infiltrations. But as far as I have seen, I don't really find anything significant that has changed in the last 2 days. We continue further south, and that brings us to the Zaporizhia region. And there, a Ukrainian military spokesperson reports that the Russians might increase their efforts towards Zaporizhia, and the enemy, meaning the Russians, would be preparing to launch a significant offensive towards the city of Zaporizhia. So, in the direction of that city. That's a bit strange, because right now the Ukrainians have the initiative here. The Ukrainians have reported that the Russian use of artillery and drones has noticeably decreased. That would fit perfectly in the context of the Ukrainian attacks in the south, because the supply situation there has definitely not developed favorably for the Russians. That they are supposed to be able to carry out an offensive toward the city of Zaporizhia while their supply lines are at risk seems at least quite strange. If we move on, we've talked about flag raisings. I received this video here, and this shows a Russian flag being raised at this location. And of course, this is supposed to show us what's happening there to some extent. Here we see a drone filming another drone that's carrying a Russian flag, which should be the flag of the airborne troops, if I'm not completely mistaken, being transported here by drone. And I can zoom in on it. The drone then flies to a wreck and places the flag on a ruin, setting the flag down there. And then, of course, you can make a video afterwards showing that you have captured this building and report to your superiors that you have advanced that far. This has now been filmed. I haven't been able to verify it yet, but we do have some drone footage from Russian positions that seems absurd. Recently, we had the Russian soldier who was at least 6 meters tall, where AI was used to simulate displaying a flag. Of course, that fits into this context. We've talked about this repeatedly here on the channel in the past, that the Russian side carries out such measures to make sure that successes are reported up the chain, even if they might not have actually happened. At this point, Snox is celebrating its birthday and has a gift for you with sensational discounts of up to 50%. Personally, I stocked up mainly on socks, because there's nothing more annoying than constantly having to sort pairs. Once you buy the same socks in a big pack, you save yourself that problem. The fact that there's an anti-hole guarantee also means that if any holes do appear, you don't have to throw the socks away within a year. You can simply exchange them. The underwear also fits perfectly, doesn't slip, and doesn't dig in either. They have an excellent rating of at least 4 out of 5 stars. And today, the black ones are available with a 25% discount, plus an additional 5% with my link. If you watch the video tomorrow, the striped boxer shorts will be 25% off, so take advantage of these one-time discounts now, only while supplies last. After the birthday promotion ends, you'll of course get the usual 20% discount with my code again. Of course, Snox will continue to use GOT's certified organic cotton, and returns are free, so trying them out is risk-free. So make sure to check out Snox through my link by August 9th to get up to 50% off, plus an extra 5% discount with my code. The attacks on the Russian air defense, of course, continue just the same. So, as documented and mentioned in this video, the destruction of a Tor M2 system is shown, as well as numerous radar stations, which you could argue are almost even more important. Because, as we just showed, the less frequently the hostile aerial object is identified, the harder it is to fight it, of course. In this respect, the radar stations are massive force multipliers here. And once again, in various places, reports are coming in of destroyed air defenses. What stands out is that we're no longer at the point where several are being destroyed every day. At least, I wouldn't say that anymore. And that could either be an indication that the Ukrainians are less capable of doing so, or, and this is the more likely point, that the attacks have crossed a critical threshold. That on the Russian side, the air defenses within the first 50 to 100 kilometers behind the front have now become so thinned out that it allows that the Ukrainians simply can't find enough targets anymore. At least that's what the current situation suggests, that fewer and fewer targets are being hit. The Ukrainians have also carried out an attack on railway bridges leading to Crimea. In the process, the one here in Chonha was hit, which is important for supplying Crimea from the north to the land bridge, both for supplying the land bridge itself and for what comes from there. And another attack took place here in the village of Vladislavivka in the oblast. That was probably this railway bridge that was attacked. And here we can see, it's in the east of Crimea, so the aim is to cut off the connection over the Kerch Strait. Here too, Ukrainian efforts to completely isolate Crimea continue. In addition, attacks are also continuing in the south. Here it is at double speed, showing a Russian convoy of 3 fuel trucks on the move. And we can see that it has an escort of other vehicles, which probably have troops with anti-aircraft weapons on board, but they obviously fail during this attack. I can't even see any shooting in the thermal images, so they seem to have completely failed here. Normally, you might expect to see a heavy machine gun in the thermal images here. Then we should actually be able to see muzzle flashes appearing there. And at least I can't see anything like that in the footage. And here we see that the first truck completely explodes after being hit. And there's a big explosion happening there. And here, obviously, burning gasoline is still leaking out. And we see that 2 vehicles have now been hit here. And the second one was probably the escort vehicle. Here are 2 more trucks on the move. And here too, one of them is hit at this point. Whether the third one was also destroyed, I can't confirm. I read that it was claimed. They said this one was destroyed too. I can see it, at least based on the footage. I don't want to go out on a limb and say that it's clearly confirmed. In any case, we also have photos of the burning wrecks on the ground. So the damage was documented. The Russians are attacking Nova Poshta facilities in Ukraine. We have several recordings of that. This is a Ukrainian private courier and postal company that also offers logistics services. There have been attacks on the Nova Poshta facilities since at least 2013. Now they are becoming much more intense, probably as revenge, if you will, for the Wildberries attacks. And there was also an attack on Rozetka in Ukraine. We can see that here. The trucks that were hit in the process. And this is the website of Rozetka. To me, it seems like a Ukrainian equivalent to Wildberries. Here too, we see a variety of products. I even saw some groceries, sweets, and similar items. Coffee here, for example. So it also seems to be an online retailer, which was hit in this case, where the Russians are trying to take revenge for the attacks on Wildberries. Meanwhile, Russia is trying to stop Ukrainian exports. More than 20 ships have been damaged so far, according to Ukrainian reports from Odessa and the surrounding area. They count about 200 Russian ships hit here. Of course you can do that, but the fact remains that the attacks on Odessa are having an effect. For example, in July alone, 56 attacks were carried out on the port of Odessa, in which 26 workers and sailors were killed. And the export of grain and food, oil for example, sunflower oil from Ukraine, has dropped massively because of these attacks. Because, of course, not much is transported by ship anymore when the attacks have become so intense. Meanwhile, there are also further attacks from the Russian side in the rear areas. And we have the report here that the Ukrainians have rationed diesel in parts of Ukraine. So at some gas stations, diesel is now being rationed. The responsible company says it's due to market developments, not, for example, insufficient purchases or other reasons. But we have Reba, who explain that this is a result of attacks on gas stations and railway infrastructure, and they cite examples. In the past, we've talked about how the Russians are now launching heavy attacks on Ukrainian gas stations near the front and about 100 to 150 kilometers behind the front. I can't say to what extent this really has nothing to do with it, since a company has no interest, especially during a war, in admitting that enemy attacks are having an effect. That actually makes sense. So it would be absolutely logical that the Russian attacks are responsible for the rationing of diesel in some areas of Ukraine. But the Ukrainians don't want to admit this. And then there was an attack in Moscow that left 3 people dead. A woman was carrying a bomb and was not allowed into a restaurant. The security guard, the woman, and a guest of the restaurant were killed in the explosion. 2 more injured people later died in the hospital. So in total, there were 5 deaths. And the daughter of the commander-in-chief of the Air Force may have been injured in the attack. And this fuels speculation, which is now also being expressed by Russian military bloggers who are better connected, namely that Colonel General Alexander Chaikov was the target of this attack. According to an opposition channel that is very well connected within the Russian security services, numerous other Russian generals and even members of parliament may also have been there. It's assumed Chaikov was celebrating his 55th birthday there. He was celebrating his birthday and his appointment as the head of the Air Force. This appointment took place in May. According to Russian media, the woman had wrapped a bomb as a gift and was stopped in the process. That would fit with the claim that she supposedly wanted to bring the general a present. And Chaikov isn't just the new commander of the Air Force, but it is said that Chaikov commanded the Russian troops north of Kyiv. So when the Russian invasion, the full-scale invasion began, he was the one commanding these troops here. the ones who committed the war crime in Bucha. So, it's obvious that this was likely an operation by the Ukrainian intelligence services to kill Chaikov. The Ukrainians also say that their attacks, that the effectiveness of the assets they had available, led to a record loss for the Russians last month. They say the Russians lost 42,860 men. In the past, I have calculated for them that the casualty numbers given by the Ukrainians about the Russians are most likely not completely accurate. That's pretty normal, with no bad intent behind it. But if we look at Russia's total recruitment numbers, then we know that roughly 1.5 million, probably even more than 1.5 million Russian soldiers, are not in the current Russian military, even though they were recruited at a time when you could only leave the Russian military if you were disabled or had fallen in battle. And that shows us that the Ukrainian casualty numbers, of course, can't be taken at face value, but they're also not completely absurd. We're not saying that, based on the available data, we know that the Russians might be missing 100,000 men, and the Ukrainians claim they've taken out over 1 million. Instead, we actually have somewhat realistic numbers from the Ukrainian side, and at least here it's being said
dass im letzten Monat 42
that in the last month, 42,860 Russian soldiers were taken out. The Ukrainians sometimes have detailed documentation of drone attacks, where of course, even if they've carried out a successful drone strike, they don't always know whether the Russian soldier has died or not. But they know that realistically, he is no longer combat capable. And loss doesn't just mean killed, it also means taken out of action due to serious injury. A new drone has been deployed by the Ukrainian side. As reported here by military informant, a drone with a new shape has been spotted flying by at relatively high speed. And this drone is probably a new one. A new drone that has not been seen before. The Russians believe it has a range of 2,000 kilometers. The warhead weighs between 100 and 200 kilograms, and the speed is between 650 and 700 km/h, which would be impressive numbers. Just for comparison, the American Tomahawks have a 450 kilogram warhead, which is about twice as much. And they fly a little over 2,000 kilometers and travel at about 900 kilometers per hour. So the range is a bit greater. The speed is about 20% higher, but realistically at dramatically higher costs, and can be produced in drastically lower quantities, in drastically lower numbers. And here it's important to point out what always matters. A smaller warhead is not automatically worse, because of course not every target requires a 450 kilogram warhead to hit it. 100 to 200 kilograms can already be completely sufficient for many targets. And then it's very helpful if you also have smaller cruise missiles. And this is obviously one of those that has now been used for the first time. And that's it for today's situation report. If you found it interesting, I'd of course appreciate a thumbs up. Leave a comment if you have something to add. And if you're new here, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and click the bell so you don't miss future videos. That's all from Torsten Heinrich. Thanks for your attention. See you soon. A special thank you to Lieutenant Colonel Mahamori, as well as to Lieutenant Finn. 5 Farbflecktarn. Jans vom Eck, Uwe die Freien, Nickname Tubib, Carsten Schulz, Tequila 42 Vision Soundlab, Immelkopf, Floja, Capri, Beartainment, Licht, Chatter, NTX, Malermeister, Nagel, Markus F., Alex Rosenthal, Matt Best, Mütter 1000 Jonas Gu, Cunningham 4500 and you, Stress. Thank you very much. Without you, it wouldn't be possible yet.